Happy Hanukkah again. Our next teacher, Rabbi Zuckier, Shlomo Zuckier, is a smicha from Yeshiva University, has learned for many years in the Kollel Elyon at Yeshiva University. Is a doctoral candidate, almost completed his doctoral dissertation at Yale. I guess we have YU today. We have Yeshiva University and Yale University. I guess it's all YU. So what is the precise title for your topic? I don't have it in front of me.
Ve-Asita, ha-Yashar, ve-HaTov, Halakhah and Ethics in the Talmud and Today.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and participating. Rabbi Zuckier.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Silver, and both for the introduction and for stealing my joke. It's really wonderful to see everyone here today. Especially everyone knows on the third day of Hanukkah they often give you off work, and to see everyone here today to learn together on their third day of Hanukkah day off is really a wonderful thing, and especially these issues of Halakhah and ethics, which tend to get overlooked at times. People don't give enough attention, maybe not as much as they should. So very excited to be learning with you, and also to see some familiar faces from when I was at Lincoln Square, so really looking forward to learning with you. Professor Reinhold's talk focused on the question of the conflation. What do you do if something seems to be both halachic and ethical? Can it be both? If it's ethical, it can't be halachic. If it's halachic, it can't be ethical. And my colleague Sarah spoke about the question about how halakha can help one become a more ethical person. What I'm going to ask is whether we really get to that point. Meaning, are there really situations where halakha and ethics overlap within Jewish tradition, or maybe one should just deny that? We already saw in both talks the specter of Leibovich haunted both talks, both shiurim, that maybe there's no room for ethics within Judaism. So we're gonna take up that question more directly in this talk, in this shiur, and we'll start with a couple of gemaras. We'll find in a couple of gemaras this idea of ethics existing outside of halacha, but somehow within Judaism more broadly. And then I'll give everyone a chance to look at some of the sources. We'll jump forward a couple thousand years or 1,500 years to the modern period, and consider some sources there as well. So that's our plan for the next almost hour and a half. We'll start with Gemara, a couple of Gemaras of Yerushalmi first, about Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach, the historical Shimon ben Shetach, lived in the 1st century BCE. This Gemara it depicts him as really one of the rabbis, as a proto rabbi. We're not going to get into questions of historicity, but what we will do is see this as how Chazal portray their rabbis, their Talmidei Chachamim, the way a Talmid Chacham should behave. And this is in Bava Metzia in the context of a whole set of questions about Hashavas Aveda, returning lost objects. To whom does one have to return a lost object? Is that mitzvah only for Jews, or does it apply to non-Jews as well? There's a whole discussion there, and at that point, it jumps into this story. So Shimon ben Shetach, Hava Asik Bahade Kitna. Shimon ben Shetach, he worked in flax, right? When you ask him what does he do, he's in flax. That's what he did. That was how he made a living. Amrin le Talmidoi, Rebbe Arpi Minach, Va'anan Zavnin Lach Chada Chamar. You're working very hard. Let's do you a favor. We'll buy you a donkey. It'll be a little easier for you to do your business. Okay, sounds good. They went to buy him a donkey from the Arab trader who was there, who's the donkey dealer, and turns out it had a precious jewel around its neck. So to their surprise. Asan Gabe, they went to Shimon ben Shetach, their rabbi. Amrin le min kedon leis atzarich tuvan. We bought you the donkey. Guess what? You're never going to have to work again a day in your life. Amrlon lama. Why? The donkey will make it easier, but I'm not going to be able to retire immediately. Amrin le zavninan la chad chamar mechad sirkai v'talibe chada margali. They said, we bought the donkey and there's a jewel around its neck. So we're in good shape. So what's his response? Amar lon viada ba mara. Does its previous owner know that this is the case, that this jewel was on it, that he gave this jewel sort of as for free along with the donkey? Amar leila, he didn't know that. Amar lon ezal chazar. Go back. He told them, go give back, return the donkey along with the jewel, or at least return the jewel to the person who sold it. So now we have a question from the rabbis at a later period in time. Lo kain amar Rav Huna baby bar gozlam b'shem Rav hitivun kumi Rebbe. Afilu keman demar gzelo shel akum aser kol ama modi shavi dasum uteres. This is several generations later. The rabbis asked in front of Rebbe. They quoted a whole bunch of rabbis saying that even according to the opinion that one cannot steal from non-Jews, this is normative Jewish law, that it's prohibited to steal whether from Jews or from non-Jews. But even according to that opinion, there's no obligation to return a lost object. There's no obligation to return a lost object to non-Jews. So what is Shlomo ben Shetach doing in this story, returning lost object? There's no such halacha. He doesn't need to return this ruby that counts as a lost object. Matun savrin. So what he responds to them, matun savrin, Shlomo ben Shetach, barbarin hava. So the response is, what do you think? Shlomo ben Shetach is a barbarian? I'm just going to go and mislead someone, not return something that when they clearly made a mistake. And so that's his response, or that's the response of the rabbis later on interpreting the actions of Shimon ben Shetach. And the Gemara then explains, by hava Shimon ben Shetach mishma brich el kahon diudai me agar kol hadein alma. What Shimon ben Shetach wanted to hear, or what he was seeking, was to have the Gentiles say, "Blessed be the God of the Jews," more than, or that was hearing "Blessed be the God of the Jews" is greater than any monetary benefit. And then it goes on to tell a couple of stories how he knew from previous occasions where a Jew had returned a lost object to a non-Jew, despite it not being the normative halacha, and the response was, "Blessed be the God of the Jews." He wanted to repeat that, and that's why he returned the jewel in this case. So what do people think? What does this tell us? What does this tell us about the relationship between halacha and ethics? Yes? Okay. And that definitely seems to come out of this, right? Halacha, the objection, he didn't have to return it. Okay, halacha is the floor. It's not obligated by halacha, but maybe one can go above and beyond and do something ethical and return it. Other views? Yes? Right? Maybe, and it sounds like, at least from the last line, right? You can compare the two lines. The line where he says, "Am I a barbarian that I wouldn't give it back?" That line sounds like there's something actually wrong in not giving it back. The following line that says he wanted to hear people say, "Blessed be the God of the Jews," sounds like the real goal is PR, right? PR for God. A Jew should be part of God's PR machine, right? So what exactly is the reason those two lines are in a bit of tension, right? Is it that in itself one should return a lost object to non-Jews? It's the right thing to do, or is it more about public perception? And again, I think maybe there's between the two comments. Would you say that Shimon ben Shetach would say it's obligatory to return that lost object? What do people think?
From where comes the obligation?
From where comes the obligation? If it's not the halacha, how could it be obligatory? Okay, do people disagree? Yeah? Where does the Lefim Mishur Adin come in? I think it comes in with the rest of the shir. So good question. Okay, so I think there's a tension here. On the one hand, it sounds like it's not the halacha. Maybe that means it's not obligatory. Maybe that means it's not obligatory as halacha, but it can be obligatory in a different way. Or maybe it's optional. Is this about an obligation in itself? Is it intrinsically right to return the object? Or is it more about God's glory? There's a lot of questions just reading this source. You can take it in a couple of different directions, and we'll see more sources that may clarify this further. Yes. Okay, to what extent can we extrapolate, right, that doing something good sanctifies God's name? Not doing it may or may not, maybe he'll find out, maybe he won't find out, but not doing it might lead to a chilul Hashem. Maybe that can strengthen it if you think about the opposite. Okay, yeah, yes, sir.
Did you deliberately translate Akum, which refers to a pagan idol worshiper, as Gentile, and how does that affect normativity for our relation in the modern era?
Okay, great. So there's, I guess, if I were giving this shiur in an academic context at university, I would have noted all of the manuscripts and all the different versions. Almost always, when we have a Gemara that says the word Akum, Ove Kochavim Mazalos, idolaters, almost always that is a function of Christian censorship in the early modern period, and the original text reads Goy. That's true 99% of the time for Gemaras, for Rambams, for Shulchan Aruchs, which were systematically censored. So I guess I could have censored back the Gemara to the original, changed it back. I like to keep the Gemara text as it is, but when you translate, you should translate with the original translation. And in any event, this Taya, this Arab, we have no reason to, it's not clear that Arab trader with a D, no reason to assume he'd be an idolater. I mean, it's not. I mean, I don't know. It's not clear from the story, at least. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Still not clear that he'd be. But so let's assume that our question relates to non-Jews in general. That seems to be the content of the discussion here. So as was noted, there's some tensions in this source. It's not fully clear. Let's jump to the next source. Now this is the Gemara Bavli. So the Aramaic, for those who study Gemara, the Aramaic might be a bit more. You might be a bit more familiar. The Gemara here is about to tell a story also about a donkey. This wasn't intentional. The story just came out this way. The donkey of Pinchas ben Yair. Pinchas ben Yair, who had this donkey who had these amazing stories involving him. We're going to focus on the beginning of the story before we get fully into the thick with the donkey. But so let's jump in. Source 2. Hashda be'emtan shel tzadikim ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevi takala al yadan tzadikim atzman lo kol shekin. So the Gemara has this line earlier. It says God would never let something bad come about through the righteous, and even for the animals of the righteous, something bad can't happen. So all the more so for the righteous themselves. And then it tells this story. My be'emtan shel tzadikim. What are these? What does it mean? The animals of the righteous, bad things don't happen. So it has this story. During Pinchas ben Yair, hava ka'azil lepidyon shvuyim. Pinchas ben Yair was going to redeem captives. This is a Jewish obligation, and maybe a moral one too. But we're not going into that now. But to redeem those who are captured when they're unjustly captured, as is often the case, to try to get them out of captivity. Paga Bay Beginai Nahara. He ran into the Ginai River on the way. In rivers back then, if you're traveling, you don't have a road. The river gets wide. It's hard to pass. So how does he get through? Amar le Ginai. He said, Ginai, Mr. River, Chalokli meimach ve'everbach. Please split for me and allow me to pass. Amar le. The river responds. And actually, some of the commentaries say, did the river actually respond, or is it in his head? Let's assume he's responding on behalf of the river, making a counter argument. Amar le. Ata holech lasos ritzon konecha. You're doing the will of your creator. You're following God's will by trying to redeem these captives. I'm doing God's will by running like water, because I'm water. I'm a river. That's what I do. I run. So I'm doing God's will as well. Ata safek ose, safek eata ose. You may or may not be successful. Right? It depends how the negotiations go. Ani vadai ose. I know I'm going to be successful. When I run, I succeed immediately. So that's the river doesn't want to split. Amar le, ima iatacholek goes rani alecha shelo yavru b'cha mayim la'olam. So when you try reasoning with someone and it doesn't work, one approach is to then threaten them. This is not advice, just the fact of human nature. So he says, if you don't split, I'm going to decree that you never have water again. Right? I'll somehow, with some magical power, will block you up. That worked. The river understood the threat and decided to split to allow Pinchas ben Yair through. Fine, so far so good. Havahu gavra the hava dari chite lepischa. A certain person was bringing some wheat for Pesach. He was going to make matzah with his wheat. He was trying to bring it from one place to another. Amar le, so Pinchas ben Yair says, Chalok le nami lahai de mitzvah asik. So, river, please split for this fellow as well, because he's going to do a mitzvah. He deserves a split river too. Chalok le, and the river split for him. Havahu taya de lava behadaihu. There also happened to be, again, another Arab trader who was along with this matzah baker fellow who was traveling along with him. Back then, fellow travelers, people would travel in groups because it was safer and for a variety of reasons. So he was traveling along with him. Amar le chalok le nami lahai. Chalok le nami lahai. So Pinchas ben Yair says to the river, split for this third fellow too, right? Not doing any mitzvah, not even Jewish. Split for him too. Why? Delo lema kach osim livnei levaya. So people shouldn't say, this is what you do to your traveling companions. You leave them behind. So that's wrong. There's something wrong about that. So you don't leave him behind. And he's willing to go so far as to ask the river to go against its nature, to go against its fulfilling God's will, and perform this miracle of splitting in order to allow not only the fellow with baking the matzah, but also his traveling companion to go through. Chalak. The river split for them. And then the Gemara remarks, Rav Yosef remarks, how great Pinchas ben Yair is. Kama nafish gavra mi Moshe v'shit and Ribivan. This person is greater than Moshe and the 600,000 when they left Egypt. Why? The ilu hasam chad zimna, right? The Reed Sea split once for Moshe. V'hachat tlasazim, and here it split 3 times. So he's even better than Moshe. And the Dilma hakanami chad zimna, maybe he really only split once and he just didn't close up and he told it to not close. So maybe it's only split once. Ela kim Moshe v'shit and Ribivan. So maybe he's only equivalent to Moshe. Still a pretty good deal, right? He comes out pretty good in this story. And the continuation where finally gets, you may be wondering, like, what's the story with the donkey, right? So we're not going to see it inside, but make a long story short, the donkey doesn't eat food that doesn't have tithe taken off. It doesn't have truma taken off. It was, and he could tell. He had some sense. He could tell whether the food was good to be eaten or not. So in this story, what exactly is what's the basis for having this river split? So again, I think there's 2 different ways of taking this as well. On the one hand, you could say, it's just the right thing to do. If people are traveling and they have someone traveling with them, even if, really one person deserves to have a river split because they're doing a mitzvah, the other one doesn't, you don't leave someone behind, right? You don't leave a person behind. That's not what you do. Apparently, seals don't do it, and rabbis don't do it either. It's just not the right thing to do. But right on the other hand, what could one counter to that reading? Yeah. Right here again, it's a delo lema. They shouldn't say. Well, why is he so worried about what people say? Just say this is the right thing to do, so I'm going to do it. So both of these cases in the Gemara, and they echo each other in certain ways, have that question: Is the person doing what seems to be the ethical thing, although not necessarily the halachic thing, or not something that's dictated by halakha? Is he doing it? Pinchas ben Yair, Shimon Shetach, are they doing it because it's the right thing to do intrinsically, or are they doing it because they're worried about what people might say? It's somewhat of an open question. For those who are interested in the sort of like the more technical philosophical side of ethics, you might say that on certain accounts of ethics, really, maybe all ethics is based on what the observer would say, right? If someone's seeing the situation would say, this is the right thing to do, maybe that's why all of ethics is binding. It's the right thing to do because the impartial observer, the ideal impartial observer would say, this is the right thing to do. So maybe we can assume that Shimon Shetach and Pinchas ben Yair were philosophers and had that understanding, or maybe, there's some intuitive basis to that as well. But it's at least an open question. Are we talking about here about ethics per se, or are we talking about PR, about making sure to do the thing that looks right, even if it's not necessarily the right thing to do inherently? That's a question, and we'll see to the extent that there's a dispute about this. And later interpreters, they presumably read the Gemara one way or the other. Source number 3, the Beis HaBachir, the Meiri, a Maimonidean Talmudist and philosopher. So we're not going to read it inside, but one of the things he emphasizes in his comments, he calls this Mimidosam Shel Talmidei Chachamim. This isn't in the second story. This isn't something that everyone has to do, but this is the right thing. This is the thing that Torah scholars generally do. So it's interesting. He emphasizes that it's, it maybe if we're asking for, if it's a question of whether this is something that's expected of everyone or something that's people, some people can go above and beyond. It's the floor, not the ceiling. Halacha is the floor, not the ceiling. Ethics can be maybe not binding, but something greater. You could read that into here, that this is, because Pinchas Ben Yair is a Torah scholar, he's expected to do more. You don't have to read it that way, but that's at least one reading. Well, let's take a look now at a couple of psukim, a couple of verses, and Sifriya Medrash that maybe talk about this in a more systematic way, right? Seeing stories can always illustrate and give you a certain insight, but they don't always, they're not as sharp necessarily as the legal passages. So we'll supplement here. We're starting with source number 4. This is one of Moshe's speeches towards the end of his life. Shemor v'shamatay is called guard and keep all of the things I command you. In order that it be good for you and your progeny forever. ha-Tov ve-HaYashar because you do what is right and what is good, or what is good and what is right in the eyes of the Lord your God, in the eyes of Hashem. So the Medrash, this phrase here, seizes on this double language, ha-Tov ve-HaYashar. Right? It could just be repetition. The Sifrei thinks maybe it's something else. So source number 5, Kisaseh ha-Tov ve-HaYashar, ha-Tov be'enei shamayim. Good means good in the eyes of heaven. Ve-HaYashar be'enei adam. And that which is right, that which is straight in the eyes of people. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva's understanding. V'cheinu omer, unsa chen v'seichel tov be'enei elokim ve'adam. Find favor and good reason in the eyes of God and of people. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, ha-Yashar be'enei shamayim. Rabbi Yishmael says, no, it's both in God's eyes. Do what's right in God's eyes, do what's good in God's eyes. There's nothing about people here. But if we are to take Rabbi Akiva, and we generally follow Rabbi Akiva, what's he suggesting here? What's Moshe's speech asserting? What do we need to do to be good Jews? What are our obligations? We need to fulfill 2 things, both what God sees as right, and what Adam, what people think is right, which presumably, assuming ethics correlates more or less with what people think is right, that should include ethics as well. That's what the pasuk says. That's how Rabbi Akiva interprets the pasuk. And we have a similar verse in source number 6, Ve-Asita ha-Yashar ve-HaTov, and this source is interpreted and applied to the context of lifnim mishuras hadin in a couple of different contexts of going lifnim mishuras hadin. We'll just a quick word about the translation of this. Let's poll the audience. How do we translate lifnim mishuras hadin? Beyond the letter of the law. That's the most common translation. Let's take a hyper literal translation. Within the line of the law, right? So what's that all about? So first of all, I personally try to avoid talking about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law within halacha because there's a little bit of a history to the term. Does anyone know where the term is from? Paul. And does Paul think that the letter of the law is a good thing? Not so much. It's part of his critique of Judaism as practiced by, let's say, the Pharisees and then the rabbis. So, of course, Judaism is not just about the technical interpretation of the law. Of course, there are values beyond that, but I generally try to avoid talking about the letter and the spirit. And especially in this context, what's the metaphor here? Why is there a line of the law? So the metaphor here, you're going within the line of the law. You're not going beyond, you're going within. So the metaphor is, let's say, you think about it like a field, right? So you have a field, you have your territory and you have the other person's territory. And going up, wherever your line is, you sort of can inhabit that area. If you go within the line, you take a step back, you're saying, yes, I can be here, but I'm yielding it to you. So let's say in the case of returning the lost object, returning the jewel, I could keep this in terms of, let's say, the letter of the law, if we use that term, or it's within the line of the law, using the literal metaphor. It's within the line of the law to keep the jewel, because there's no obligation to return it. But I'm going to go within the line of the law. I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to yield to you. I'm going to let you have back your lost object, because even though it's not obligatory as halacha, maybe it's the right thing to do as lifnim mishuras hadin. So that there's a whole literature on that, which which I think we're gonna see in just a couple of minutes. I think let's just check how much time we have, and I think we're gonna split up for let's say for 20 minutes. We'll split up. We will be looking at. You can look at source number 7 if you want, but there's a fairly lengthy section on Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein's position. He was a beloved teacher of mine, passed away a few years ago, and has probably the most important, at least English language article on this issue, on Judaism and an ethic outside of halacha and how to understand that. So we have some passages from his approach and some additional passages after that. See what you can get through with your tables. We're definitely not going to get through everything when we reconvene, but at least you'll have a Hanukkah present from me, the handout, which you can look at peruse at your leisure. So yeah, we'll do that now for the next 20 minutes with either a partner or your table. Consider the sources primarily from 8 and forward. All right. As sad as I am to take you away from your conversations, I think we're reconvening now. So just first a word on Rabbi Lichtenstein. I said was my teacher. So he was primarily a Rosh Yeshiva. He spent his nights and days studying and teaching Talmud, first at YU and then Yeshivat Har Etzion in Israel. On the side, I like to say he had, in his spare time, he was a one-man think tank. So he has these very well thought out programmatic articles on a whole host of topics. Maybe one of the first ones and also one of the best known ones is this article on cited extensively in number 11. Does Jewish tradition recognize an ethic independent of halacha? So we'll be spending a little bit of time on that. Just before we get there, source number 8. This idea, we're discussing ethics within religion. This is not to mean that ethics outside of religion isn't also valuable. Of course, Rabbi Lichtenstein valued that as well, but his position is going to be that the source of ethics is not some external thing to Judaism. It's part of Judaism itself dictates that one be ethical, even if those ethical points can't be found explicitly in any particular halacha. And sources 9 and 10 situate this the piece we're about to look at, both that it's the most cited article and that it's sort of the setting it was in, a conference on ethics in 1972, published a couple years later. But if we're going to jump in now for reasons of time, we'll jump in at source number 11, citations from the article itself, and everyone's invited to read the entire piece when they have a chance, but we'll try to get the main points out of the article. Rav Lichtenstein starts by thinking about the questions of natural morality. And there are a few Gemaras that may support this view that somehow baked into nature, baked into the way the world is created, God made us ethical. So, for example, the fact that we have an impulse to be ethical much of the time, that might be God's way of, formulating the world such that ethics is assumed and ethics is mandatory. So there, as I said, there's some Gemara sources that indicate that possibility. And Rav Lichtenstein's response is, but let's say that's true. Let's say there is some natural basis, but one could respond that when the Torah was given at Har Sinai, the Gemara says this, and this is codified, all previous obligations were sort of wiped away, and the Torah is the single binding document of the Jewish people. So maybe, you might even say non-Jews are bound by natural morality, but Jews, by virtue of the fact that the Torah was given at Har Sinai, that sort of reset everything. Everything has to be a function of the Torah and of commandment. And if you know Rav Lichtenstein's thought, the idea of commandment, the idea of God as a commander, as the one who gave the Torah and all the mitzvos, all the commandments that are a part of it, that's really a central theme. So that even if you accepted natural morality, it wouldn't yield the conclusion that part of Judaism is being ethical. So we'll start with that here at the top of the page. The question is not what vestiges of natural morality continue to bind the Jew, or to what extent receiving the Torah abrogated any antecedent ethic. So that's with that being said, then now you can ask the following question. It is rather whether, quite apart from the ground common to natural and halachic morality, the demands and guidelines of halacha are both so definitive and so comprehensive as to preclude the necessity for any other ethic. Meaning, let's assume that natural morality is superseded by halacha. Does that mean that halacha itself is sufficient? And we're going to clarify what that means. But as we go forward, just continue reading. I am, of course, taking two things for granted. I assume first that halacha constitutes, or at least contains, an ethical system. Right? Halacha is not just a bunch of empty things that one should do just because one's commanded to do them. Halacha actually represents values, represents ethical principles, even if they don't fully overlap with, or at least the formulated Torah doesn't overlap fully with what we would see as ethical, maybe intuitively. Second, I assume that at most, we can only speak of a complement to halacha, not of an alternative. Right? You can't say, let's get rid of the Torah and do something else. That's not an option on the table. And ethics so independent of halacha, so as to obviate or override it, clearly lies beyond our pale. And with these two assumptions, what two views is Rav Lichtenstein sort of setting aside as out beyond his scope? One that views halacha as not ethical, as sort of empty commands. Whose view is that? Leibovich, right? We heard about Leibovich a little bit today. And the second approach, that have some sort of replacement to halacha that's rejected, what would that look like? Well, I think within a Jewish context. So there are some approaches to Judaism that say halacha is no longer binding, or never was binding, or isn't binding. So that's also out of bounds. So, and we'll see, and once we're done going through this source, we'll look at some of those alternatives at least quickly. So that set aside, halacha is binding, and halacha represents values. Now the question is, what about other values that are not in the halacha? Are they binding as well? And if so, how? Essentially then, continuing inside, the question is whether halacha is self-sufficient. If all you have is halacha, and let's assume that means the halacha and the Shulchan Aruch, you open up Jewish legal code, you open up Sfarim, Jewish legal books, you can find all the answers. That's halacha. Is that self-sufficient? Is that enough? Its comprehensiveness and self-sufficiency are notions many of us cherish in our more pietistic or publicistic moments, right? It feels really frum to be able to say, like, the Torah is all we need, halacha is all we need. There's nothing beyond halacha. If, however, we equate halacha with the din, if we mean that everything can be looked up, every moral dilemma resolved by reference to code or canon, the notion is both palpably naive and patently false. So the idea that all of ethics or anything you ever need to do can be found in a sefer, you can just look it up and it'll tell you the halacha, and that'll always be the right thing to do ethically. That's simply not true. You can quote the Chazon Ish, who says that moral duties sometimes constitute one corpus with halachic rulings, and sometimes not, he implies. And jumping ahead a couple of lines, there are moments when one must seek independent counsels. Recognition of this element rests upon both textual and practical evidence. And skip a sentence. Which of us has not at times been made painfully aware of the ethical paucity of his legal resources? Now, this is a big move. As I said, Rav Lichtenstein was a Talmudist first, a Talmud Chacham, studied Talmud, and he said, if all you have is the halacha, you sometimes will feel there's a real paucity. You feel there's something missing from the whole system of halacha. Namely, sometimes something ethical will seem clearly true, and yet you can't find it in any halachic source. Right? This is not what your average Rosh Yeshiva might say, but this is an admission, a candid admission by Rav Lichtenstein. This is something that really bothers him. Right? If you just look at halacha, it seems like certain ethical principles are not there. Who has not found that the fulfillment of explicit halachic duty could fall well short of exhausting clearly felt moral responsibility? Even the full discharge of one's whole formal duty as defined by the din often appears palpably insufficient. And this is sort of laying out the problem, right? If you come from the standpoint that halacha is all you need, you're going to find that there are sometimes gaps, there are sometimes holes, and things that and things that seem that like they're right ethically are outside. Given this problem, Rav Lichtenstein attempts to find within halacha, within traditional, or at least within Torah, within traditional Judaism, sources that would indicate that ethics are also part of what God expects from us, part of normative Judaism writ large, even if not part of halacha in particular. In doing this, he draws upon a Ramban, Nachmani's commentary on the Torah, which there are actually a couple of sibling pieces, one of which was in source number 7. We're not going to look at them inside, but we'll look at them as they're summarized here. Continuing with the selection from page 69. In a celebrated passage, Nachmanides explains that the general command, you shall be holy, kadoshim to you, was issued because the scope of the Torah's injunctions regarding personal conduct notwithstanding, a lustful Sybarite could observe them to the letter and yet remain a scoundrel with Torah license, a naval b'reshut Torah. So it's possible, if you can check off every mitzvah box, every halachic box, and still live your life just indulging in materialism at all times. Right? You can just eat all the most expensive foods all day, have multiple wives as the Torah allows biblically, and be with them all day. Right? You could just indulge in the world, and that would seem to be the wrong way to live. But what's wrong with it? You're following the halacha, right? One might do that. That's the Ramban's objection. The same holds true, he continues, with respect to social ethics. Right? You can find a lot of cases the Torah doesn't say, you'll have a loophole where you can hurt someone in some way without breaking any halacha. For example, if we have our case before, not returning the lost jewel, right? Person's never going to know, but they'll find out that they lost it somehow. They're going to lose a lot, but there's no halacha that's broken. So maybe that should be fine. Hence, there too, the Torah has formulated a broad injunction, and this is the Torah's mode, to details and then to generalize in a similar vein. So that's why the Torah says, "Kadoshim to you, be holy." Holy meaning prushim, separate oneself from things, not just from materialism, but from anything that one really shouldn't be doing, even if there's no technical injunction that one can find. For after the admonition about the details of civil law and all interpersonal dealings, it says generally, and thou shalt do the right and the good, Ve-Asita, ha-Yashar, ve-HaTov, which we saw earlier. And that includes as a positive command, justice and accommodation, and all lifnim mishurat hadin, in order to oblige one's fellow. So the Ramban invokes there this category of lifnim mishurat hadin, within the line of the law, to not take advantage of everything that's legally, halachically available to someone, but to take a step back to say, you know what, it really would be better if I let the person have the jewel back. You know what, it would really be better if I didn't just indulge in physical pleasure in my all day and instead had other pursuits. You know what? It would be better for me to help out someone even if it's not commanded. That's the Ramban on the Fnim Mishras Hadin. And the continuation, Rav Lichtenstein goes through a whole variety of Rishonim, of medieval Jewish scholars, and how they categorize this commandment of the Fnim Mishras Hadin, or this concept, because some count it as a positive commandment in the Torah. So there's an obligation to do things that are not included, to do what's right, even if it's not included in any other obligation. Some count it as a rabbinic obligation. Some don't count it at all within their scope of the mitzvos. So there's a whole discussion there. If we jump back to the text, this exposition of all those commentaries, all those medieval authorities, is open, and Rav Lichtenstein prefers, unsurprisingly, the positions that really categorize lifnim mishras hadin, giving up going beyond what one has to do on just the legal, on just the halachic obligations. He prefers the stronger formulations, ones that count it as a mitzvah in the Torah. If you do that, there are two obvious objections. First, if lifnim mishras hadin is indeed obligatory as an integral aspect of halacha, in what sense is it supra-legal? Right? If you say, right, let's if you have a system of rules where one of the rules is, even if something is not included in the other rules, it's included in this rule, right? So that's sort of like a self-defeating rule, because is that rule within the system or not? Because if it is, then as soon as you say something's not within the rules, it's now in this rule. So can there be an obligation of going beyond one's obligations? And what would that even mean? So that seems to be a problem, at least a logical problem of sorts. What distinguishes its compulsory elements from din proper? How is the lifnim mishras hadin different than any other obligation? And it sounds like it's different. It sounds like its quality is doing something super legal, doing something that's not within the law, but yet it's codified within the law. So how does that work? Secondly, isn't this exposition mere sham? So it sort of comes out funny if you say, well, something's missing from halacha. Well, so it must be that it's actually there, and that's the conclusion. That's like a shortcut. You're sort of cheating if you say, well, if something is missing and I think it shouldn't be missing, I'll just say it's there. What's really the basis of that? Isn't that just a sham? So he then goes on to explicate in more detail how exactly this works, how exactly the system works, and to try to resolve those problems a little bit, and more also just to flesh out his own opinion. So continuing inside, skipping a bit, he talks about the difference between din, between the law, and lifnei mishuras hadin, the super legal going within the line of the law. So din consists of a body of statutes, ultimately rooted in fundamental values, but which at the moment of decision confronts the individual as a set of rules. So, right, din, the law, it's a set of rules. It's, of course, highly differentiated, numerous variables, making the relevant rule a function of the situation. The basic mode is that of formulating and defining directives to be followed by in a class of cases. It has a quality of generality, and then you apply those general rules to different situations. A little bit like what we heard before in the Rambam that was quoted in both of the previous talks. I'm only quoting because they did, but the Rambam there talks about how law is general, therefore it can't work for everyone, right? If it's going to be overly general, it won't necessarily work for every person. The same thing, it won't work in every situation because it'll help you 95% of the time, but in that 5% of the time, the law won't accomplish its goal. So metaphors that speak of laws as controlling or governing a case are therefore perfectly accurate. Fine. That's law. That's din. Lifnim mishurat hadin, by contrast, is the sphere of contextual morality. So this is the idea. What does it mean that there's a law that's different, that's going beyond the law? What does that mean? It's this idea of contextual morality, the sort of thing you can't legislate, but is still binding, and you need to figure out on a case-by-case basis, as he's about to explicate. Its basis for decision is paradoxically both more general and more specific. So the formalist, right? So whereas within the law you have a specific rule that you apply in each case, within morality you don't have this middle distance guideline. Instead, you have a very universal general principle: do what's right and good, let's say, or be holy, don't indulge in physical things too much, or however you take that. Those are the super general principles, and then by a bunch of super applied principles or super applied interpretation of the scenario at hand. So that's what lifnei mishuras hadin is. It's about taking super general principles, applying them in specific situations in a way where the law couldn't cover it. The law isn't going to get every situation. There's going to be loopholes. There's going to be workarounds. There's going to be exceptions to the law. And if you want to do the right thing, which is the goal, the law's ultimate goal, you sometimes need to work not through law, but through ethics, through morality, through lifnim mishuras hadin. But that's ultimately what God wants as well. That's also part of what Torah expects. It's not in the halacha because it can't be. It's impossible to govern every situation, which is what the Ramban actually says there as well. So that's the view of Rav Lichtenstein here. Ethics comes from the Torah. It's mandated by this principle, this principle / mitzvah of lifnei mishuras hadin, the obligation to do the right thing, even when it's not part of the law, even if it's not part of the halacha. And that's not a problem per se. The reason why it wasn't codified is because certain things can't be codified. There's always a workaround for the law. My wife's a lawyer, so I know this. No, we try to be ethical too. But there's always a workaround for the law. And the question is, if you're ethically motivated, you'll make sure to do the right thing, even in the face of that. And we'll close with the conclusion here, and then we'll have questions. Just with the citation from page 83 that gives the overall picture of Rav Lichtenstein's view. Traditional halachic Judaism demands of the Jew both adherence to halacha and commitment to an ethical moment that, though different from halacha, is nevertheless of a piece with it. So separate in some ways, but really part of the same bigger picture, and in its own way, fully imperative, right? Not quite as imperative as halacha, but also imperative. What I reject emphatically is the position that, on the one hand, defines the function and scope of halacha in terms of the latitude implicit in current usage. To say halacha means something you can look up in a sefer, to say both that, and yet identifies its content with the more restricted sense of the term. Right? To say that halacha is both things you can look up in a book and the only thing that's binding, then you have a problem, because you're saying that ethics are not binding unless they're already codified in halacha. That's a problem. The resulting equation of duty and din and the designation of super legal conduct as purely optional or pietistic is a disservice to halacha and ethics alike. And the final paragraph of the article, in dealing with the subject, I have in effect addressed myself both to those who, misconstruing the breadth of its horizons, find the halachic ethic inadequate, There are people who say halacha ignores ethics and therefore halacha is a problem. And to those who smugly regard its narrow confines as sufficient. It's also disagreeing with people who say halacha doesn't include ethics, and that's great. Don't do ethics, right? Both of those approaches are wrong. They're misunderstanding halacha. Halacha, or they're misunderstanding Judaism. Judaism includes not just halacha, but beyond. Does tradition recognize an ethic independent of halacha? It really depends on how you define your terms, right? So this add-on piece of ethics to halacha, it's not quite halacha, it's sort of part of it, but not exactly. So is it independent of halacha or not? That's an open question. Is it binding? It certainly is binding. That's Rav Lichtenstein's view. Ethics are binding, not quite as halacha, as some sort of add-on to halacha, based on the principle of lifnim mishras hadin. Now, there's some hands. Yes.
I just wonder if he has a view about when the specific contextual type of extra law it goes over to or pull back as opposed to, or is he saying no? It only goes that direction. It doesn't go.
So that's a great question, and you can really ask, sort of a double-edged question, because what we're talking about here is an add-on to halacha. Halacha is binding in this set of cases. There may be another set of cases where ethics are binding. What about when there's a clash? What about when the Torah says do something, but it seems like an ethical problem? What do you do? What do you do then, right? So this is a great question, and it doesn't come up in this article. Not only does it not come up in this article, if you look throughout Rav Lichtenstein's writings, he, as much as he can, avoids that question. He's unwilling to take a stance, which I think is very telling, because often you have people who, I guess what you would say in their more pietistic or publicistic moments, right? They would say, this is the ultimate loyalty test, and isn't it great? Halacha clashes with morality, and we just, we sort of put you on the line. That's not his view. I can't see Rav Lichtenstein ever saying that you shouldn't keep the halacha. That simply would not be him. But at the same time, those cases of conflict are real problems, because ethics at some level is also binding, and there has to be something has to give. There has to be some misunderstanding, but it would be impossible that there would be a conflict. So I think that responds to your question, but it also shows the strength of the conviction behind this position. That's your.
Isn't this all kind of a distinction without a difference? In the sense that if you look at all the different opinions that are collected within this source sheet and beyond the source sheet, there's a lot of discussion about how do you define halacha, how do you define ethics when you're talking about not clashing, when you're talking about a level beyond. But if you take the sources, if you take Rabbi Lichtenstein and you put in opposed to the Bartanura, for example.
We're not there yet, but yeah.
But if you argues that halacha, that ethics is subsumed within halacha, there's not necessarily a practical difference that comes out from that. Like you could easily imagine a world where Rabbi Lichtenstein and the Bartanura are sitting together debating about whether or not there's something called ethics that's beyond halakha. But then when you go through a list of practical examples about what you're supposed to do in certain situations, they would agree 100% of the time. So okay, this exercise.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's a question that I think it would only be fair to ask after we see the other views. But I think it's hard, and it's hard to flesh this out. My sense is the theoretical disputes certainly do correlate to real world examples. I can just, I can throw out a couple of examples from Rav Lichtenstein's life where he took unpopular public stances on ethical issues relating, let's say, to the Israeli government and whatnot. So it does play itself out. It's not just a coincidence that someone who has strong views on ethics is willing to have them play out when other rabbis who have different views on ethics don't. But it's a good question, but I think we don't really have time to address it fully. I'll take a couple more questions and then we'll go forward. Yes. So I guess you right. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're limited very quickly. The understanding that you have to do it and intend to do it because of Eva, not out of ethics, I think Rabbi Lichtenstein rejects. If I understand, if I think spoke about it and or wrote about it. That's an example where you find within halacha, you find a loophole to be able to accommodate ethics. But what about when you don't have the loophole? And that's a real question. But certainly if you can find the loophole, then use it and do it not just because not because you have to do it, but because it's also the right thing to do. Last question, then we'll move forward. Yeah.
You say that Rabban as a political and Rosh Yeshiva never had to take a position where there was a conflict between halacha and ethics?
I didn't say that. No, I said it was a real. He never in any of his writings never said what to do in that situation. Yes, the question was whether Rav Lichtenstein never took a stance on anything involving halacha and ethics. The response was, I'm sure he did, but he never wrote about it. Let's move on to with our remaining time. We'll skip the related views where there's some interesting things about natural morality and Torah not superseding previous obligations of ethics, and something close to what we heard in the previous year about halacha as training people to act ethically. We're going to skip all that, unfortunately, but really, it is my gift to you and feel free to study those sources in your spare time. We'll jump to oppositional views because there's nothing like a good machlokas. So as we saw at the beginning of Rav Lichtenstein's piece, he sort of notes at the beginning, there's two different ways one could argue more or less complete with his approach, be totally outside. One is to reject the idea that halacha is binding. And Eugene Borowitz, passed away also just a few years ago, a Reform theologian, took that stance in an article much longer than the short quote we have here, where he argues that there are various ways in which halacha and ethics clash, and halacha doesn't deal with ethical issues, and the proper move is just to adopt ethics and to say that's the primary obligating normative system, and halacha is not. And maybe you can keep halacha if you want, but halacha is not the primary thing that binds us. Ethics becomes that. So that's the approach is taken. And the quote here is, if you really think that rabbinic teachings the halacha is ethical, at least under certain interpretations, so why don't you embrace it and say that it's binding? Why don't you take Rav Lichtenstein's view that halacha is binding and there are other obligations? And his response is, to many Jews today, the Torah's ethical behests come with such imperative quality that they can consider them properly heard only when they are accepted categorically. It's sort of all or nothing. In halacha, to qualify their functioning as substantially as do the spokesmen of contemporary rabbinic Judaism, must be seen by them as requiring less than what God now demands of the people of Israel. So in his view, if you accept halacha with all of its problems, you won't be able to incorporate ethics. The halacha would sort of take over, and that's why he takes that position. Again, that's obviously one approach. I guess you call it an antinomian or an anti-halachic, anti-binding halacha view that Eugene Borowitz took on one side. We'll now spend some more time on the other side which is the view also foreshadowed in the beginning of the article that not that halacha, not that ethics sort of override halacha, but that halacha is not about ethics at all. It's nothing to do with values. Halacha is just a set of rules that one has to do, and the Torah doesn't care at all about ethics. That's just not of interest to the Torah at all. That's not of interest to Judaism. So one source that often gets quoted is source 18 here, the Bartanura, which was referenced in one of the questions before. This is the Bartanura's introduction to Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos, often translated as Ethics of the Fathers, but probably just means chapters of the Fathers. But anyway, so about ethical issues, of course. Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. That's the first Mishnah. So he says, Omer Ani, Lefisha Mesechah Zo Ena Miusedes Al Perish Mitzvah Mi Mitzvos HaTorah. Kasher Mesechah Mishnah. Most of the Mishnah is talking about mitzvos, right? This is the one tractate of Mishnah that's not really about mitzvos. It's about something else. Elakula Musar Mumidos. It's all about ethics and character traits, character virtues. V'chachmei u'masa olam gamkin chivru svarim. K'moshe badu miliva medarkei hamusar Ketzad Yisnaig Adam Im Chavero. And if you look outside of Judaism, other religions, other thinkers have all sorts of ethical writings and writings about virtue that they came up with themselves. That's not from Revelation. That's why, of all the Masechtas of Mishnah, this one starts with the transmission from Sinai, right? Moshe got the Torah from Sinai, gave it to Yeshua, Yeshua to the Nevi'im, etc., all the way down to the rabbis. Why does this tractate, out of all the tractates, start with that? Because Lomer Lecha Shamidos ve'Musarim shebezo Masechta Lo Badu Osam Chachmei Mishnah Milibam Ela Af Elu Nemru B'Sinai. That teaches you the fact we start with the transmission that everything that's in Avos, it's not made up, it's not thought of by the rabbis themselves as philosophy. It's received traditions, it's revelation, it's Torah just as much as the laws of Peah or Kilayim or Shabbos or whatever else would be from God, part of the revelation from God, and that's why we start with the transmission. So this statement is often adopted as a way of saying that the only thing that's binding in terms of ethics is things that are in halachic sources, such as the Mishnah of Avos, which, I guess the question is how exactly to apply that. But more frequently, you look in halachic sources, you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch, etc. You look in the Gemara, you figure out your ethics from there. That approach is taken by Rabbi J. David Bleich, actually also a teacher of mine, in source number 21, where he cites Bartanura, and in the bottom paragraph on the page, does Judaism recognize a subjective morality? Is there room in Judaism for accommodation of the moral demands advanced by individual conscience? Which, if you read Rav Lichtenstein's article, what would you answer? Yes. And he says, to that question, the answer must be an emphatic no. The question is unequivocally answered in the negative by Ravadi Bartanura that we just saw. Skipping down a bit, the content of a system of ethics of this nature is not only objective rather than subjective, but is, accurately speaking, merely a subcategory of halacha. Ethics has to be codified in halachic sources for it to be binding. Actually, in this article, Rabbi Bleich says, of course, Rav Lichtenstein must agree with him. So he must have a different reading of the article, but that's worth spending reading in closer detail. And then he says, is there natural morality that can be discovered by reason? Maybe there can be, but it won't be binding. And maybe once one studies enough halacha, one can understand the overall morals or ethics of halacha and apply them, and that he's willing to accept. And that's what he calls das Torah. So the only ethic independent of halacha he's willing to accept is das Torah. Great Torah scholars can internalize enough about Torah that they can apply it to other areas, but for this idea of subjective morality, if someone just saying this seems wrong, he's unwilling to accept that. As was mentioned, we did not get into questions of the conflict between halacha and ethics. One Rav Lichtenstein himself doesn't talk about it. Moshe Halbertal, student of Rav Lichtenstein's, has a book, very interesting book, Ma'apechot Parshaniyot Be'Tavutan, Interpretive Revolutions in the Making, where he argues that Chazal, in some places, utilize ethical concerns as part of their interpretive hermeneutic. So the way that they understand halacha, understand psukim, is based in some cases on their ethical intuitions. One of his examples is like the Ben Sora Umore, the rebellious son who gets killed. So the Gemara says it never happened. It has these very difficult to achieve standards. Halbertal argues that that's due to ethical concerns. So that's an interesting approach, and it's sort of, in a sense, taking Rav Lichtenstein's thought a step further, a step that he himself did not take. There's more to say on this topic. I have some thoughts on what Rabbi Soloveitchik's view is on this, Rav Lichtenstein's teacher and father-in-law, and he actually has an article or gave a talk that was recently published relating to the same issue, months apart from when Rav Lichtenstein gave his talk. That was the basis of the article. We don't have time to get into it, unfortunately, but I guess feel free to study that and consider what the Rav's view might be. Just to sum up, we saw in the Gemaras there are at least a possibility of reading the Gemaras as showing that there's some ethical principle that's obligatory beyond halacha. And I think in the second case, one thing that was very interesting was his focus on doing God's will, right? That Pinchas ben Yair says, I'm doing God's will. The river says, no, I'm doing God's will. I shouldn't yield to you. And maybe that's the right way of framing this. And that this may fit well with Rav Lichtenstein's view as well. That at the end of the day, the goal, the ultimate arbiter of one's actions shouldn't be halacha. Halacha is part of it, but maybe the ultimate arbiter should be doing God's will. And doing God's will is a lot broader than halacha. It includes things like ethics as well, assuming that you can demonstrate that. And Rav Lichtenstein made a very strong argument, and I think well cited and in that direction, that one can have halacha, one can have ethics, and have the two build on one another. Have the ethics come out of the halacha, but also come as part of this broader idea of doing God's will. And although there's objection to that on both sides, I certainly this article for me certainly is a very powerful idea that when we're halacha is not to the exclusion of ethics. It's part of it. It's the basis of it, and ethics comes out of halacha, and certainly comes out of our broader obligations as serving God. Thank you all, and Freilich and Hanukkah.
Okay, I just wanted to thank Rabbi Zuckier, thank Zager, and Professor Reinhold in his absence. Thank him as well. Thank you all for coming. I'm hoping we can do more events like this and bring more Torah to the community. Drisha and Wicked Square Synagogue partnered on this particular event. Stay tuned for other events. Thank you very much. I thought today's session raised some very important questions that we really didn't have a chance to fully explore about halacha in particular. So I think there are sort of implicit questions to be raised about halacha that have emerged from these sessions. Maybe in the future we can pursue that further. Thank you once again.